how beautiful it is and how easily it can be broken. Things are incredibly easy to destroy, but they are exceptionally difficult to build. All politicians discover this at some point, even if they didn't know it before they go into politics. It's extremely easy to pull down. It's very hard to build up. All critics know this. All journalists and others have to bear this in mind all the time. It's very easy to be a critic. It's very hard to create. Yet it's creation, not criticism, that builds societies and indeed inspires people and gives life meaning. Now, I've been, as I say, traveling all across this continent for many years, and I've also been traveling for a long time across many of the parts of the world that are not as lucky as our part of the world. I've traveled for a long time in the Far East, in the Middle East, across Africa, across sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that my travels, at least, have told me have reiterated to me that thing of how exceptionally lucky we are in Europe, how fortunate we are. And to my mind, great fortune requires a great amount of care and curation. I'm very suspicious of people who think that you can carry out great experiments on things that are already working pretty well. Because I know that the person who thinks they can really fundamentally improve or change the society is really likely to show you new ways to screw it up. Many of the facts that I describe in this book, many of the facts that I spend a lot of time worrying about, many of the thoughts and the concerns I've expressed, in some countries seem crazy almost. Like, how could that be a concern of yours? Why aren't you more worried about ABC? And in other places, people say to me, "Oh yeah, we know that." I was giving a speech recently in the Netherlands, and I said to somebody, "Where do you think the debate is here roughly at the moment?" And my host said, "If you were to go on stage and say that there are problems with multiculturalism, you will bore this audience. We know that." I thought, well, that's interesting, because it's not the case everywhere. If I go to Germany and I give a speech saying that there are some problems in multiculturalism, world of pain. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. One of the ways I sometimes express this is to say what I say is no longer controversial in my own country, although I recognize that it's controversial in some other countries. But for instance, what I say is now said by many, many distinguished thinkers and philosophers and journalists and politicians on the left in France. Why is that? Only because of events. It's very easy to wish problems away when they're not right in front of your eyes. They're very, very hard to wish them away if you lose 130 people in a single night in Paris, or you lose another 80 people just because they're on the seafront in Nice on Bastille Day. It's very hard to say there's no problem if, in that case, within 1 year, you have all of your most prominent atheist satirists massacred, and a Catholic priest having his throat slit at the altar of a church in Rouen as he's saying Mass. It's very hard in that situation to continue to live in a bubble of denial and much more. But other countries, it's possible still to live in that element of denial. And I suppose we'll come on to that a bit later. But first, let me just say some things about the general outline of what I've been thinking about, what I've been looking into in recent years that's come into this book, The Strange Death of Europe. The whole thing, in a way, boils down to two major issues. The first bit one might call a them issue. People don't like us and them, they say it's a dichotomy, okay. There is a them issue. There is a question of people coming to Europe, who they are, what the claims are, and there are us issues. What is about us that means that this happens? There are many other ways in which to look at this, but this seems to me to be a beginning of something. Now, the them bit of the migration discussion is, in some ways, the hardest part for people to swallow. But in my mind, incidentally, it's not the most interesting, but let me deal with it very quickly. The them bit is what I describe as a speeding up of a process that's gone on for decades. And that process is the process that began in most of Europe after the Second World War, when most Western European countries decided, trying to build up from the catastrophe that had occurred, they would, among other things, bring in guest workers from often former colonies, sometimes not, to help rebuild their countries. And one of the things I say in the book about this is it's very, very understandable why this happens. We all know the history, we know the causes, and nobody blames the people who came. They were asked to come very often, invited to come. But nobody ever expected anything that happened from then on to happen. It's something that amazingly Chancellor Merkel said in her Potsdam speech in 2010. She said in that speech, "We thought that they would go home." Incredible admission, that, when you think about it. What an extraordinary admission to make. That, for instance, in the case of Germany, you would import millions of workers from Turkey, and you thought that they would come and do the job and help Germany and then go back to Ankara or wherever. It's an extraordinary admission that nobody foresaw that, for instance, a young Turkish man might go to Germany for work, and a young Turkish man might quite understandably want to meet a woman at some point. And if a man meets a woman, there are various things that often happen, so I'm told. Never looked into it. And that as a result, you have children. The children have to find a school, or you have to find a school for the children, and they might be in the welfare system, and so on and so forth. The idea that nobody thought any of this through, and that they were simply meant to go there, and then go back there. Extraordinary admission. But that was just the first one. And there, from then on, you see a set of things happen. And you see, for those of us who are members of the public, we tend to hope that people in control and in power have some plan or have some idea of what they're doing. But post-war migration is the great demonstration that nobody knew what the hell they were doing. Because various things have to be done after events have occurred. So in Europe, you get this very interesting stage where every country at different points decides, for instance, okay, these people are staying. Now, what do we do? And many countries, most countries at some point, decided that they would become a different type of country. It began by saying, whatever you would like to do, whatever your own gig, you can do it here, and we won't interpose ourselves. This was the period that was often described as the multicultural period. You can be in Denmark or Norway or Britain or Germany or anywhere else, and you'll basically do whatever it was you did in your home country, and you'll live the life you lived, and we won't particularly, as long as there are very, very basic rules you don't break, we don't make any claim. And then people started to realize that that wasn't so good, so then people said, actually we need to work on integration. And then this pseudo-science of integration sprung up. No, having told you to come, expected you to go, realized you hadn't, told you you could do what you wanted, we're now going to tell you to become like us. It's an incredibly confused set of messages, and I don't blame anybody who found that confusing, who'd come, because God knows it's very confusing for those of us who were always here. So this whole period had already been going on. These massive confusions had already been going on. And I give a lot of the stats and the figures and so on in the book. But I was so struck in 2015 because I think that what happened in 2015 was exactly what had been happening for decades, but massively sped up. And during that time, I was traveling all around the continent, but specifically around the points of entry in southern Europe, in Italy and in Greece. Because I realized from the moment that Merkel, before Merkel had made her famous invitation and the Wir schaffen das comments on the last day of August 2015, I realized that what was happening was seismic for this continent. Seismic because what it was doing was speeding up an issue which we still hadn't been able to address when it had been at a much slower and slower rate. So, for instance, if you are having problems integrating people when migration is at a relative historic low, why would you think you could do it better when it's at an all-time high? What would be the rationale for that? If you're doing a very bad job of integration at that point, why would you be doing it so much better if you sped it up? Well, there is no answer to this other than that, again, nobody knew what they were doing. And all you could do at that point was warn. Now, during that period in 2015 and 2016 when I was traveling, and by the way, I mean, one of the things I never can help noticing is that some of my critics who like to present themselves as great internationalists never go anywhere. There's a certain type of what I call parochial internationalism that is developed in our countries, where you don't kind of have to know much about the world or go there much because you just love it innately. I travel around and I speak to people. And in 2015, 2016, I was particularly making sure that I was speaking to the people who are coming in the migrant camps in Southern Europe and finding out their stories, finding out why they were coming. And that's an important thing for another reason, by the way, which is that I think there are impossible dreams that are dreamed on every political side. There are some people who say it's very easy, just nobody come. I say, well, if you think that's the case, you have to stare this issue in the face. You have to meet the people who that would impact upon. You have to see what this would mean. So there's a sort of easy fantasy that people have which ignores the human face of these issues. In the same way that there are those who say, let the whole world come, or at least open the doors and let's not bother, who also don't bother to look in the face of what this means, who don't want to know the experiences of people in Europe that leads to, for instance, or who think, let's be very generous and invite everybody to come and then just ignore them, let them be, leave them to sort of go off up into Europe. And I say at one point in the book that I understand, in a way, both of these dreams, albeit they're sort of nightmarish. And that second one, I'd had myself. I describe it in the book, that idea of standing in a camp, hearing all these stories, meeting all these people, and you think, yes, maybe we could come up with a system where that family goes to that village, and that everyone gets a family, or everyone gets a person, and that person could go into that town in the north of Norway, and that person could go into that one. Because you can dream these dreams in the abstract. But we have to do better than that. We have to do so much better than that. And what I realized in 2015 was that nobody was thinking about the deeper issues. Nobody was thinking about them. I saw with my own eyes the fact that, yes, there were people coming in 2015 who were fleeing, for instance, the Syrian civil war, although most of the people who were fleeing that had already got out by then. Yes, there were people fleeing conflict. Yes, there were people who were fleeing unbelievable situations in Afghanistan, for instance. Unbelievable stories. But most of the people who I was meeting were not people fleeing Homs or Kabul. Most of them were from sub-Saharan Africa, and they were men, young men. And they were here, they had fled economic deprivation, no doubt about that, but they were not what you would call asylum seekers, or at least they were people who had no legitimate claim for asylum. And you could see this with your own eyes in 2015. 2016, the Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, admitted this himself in an interview with Dutch media when he said that the Frontex, the EU border agency figures, the Frontex figures themselves showed that of the arrivals in 2015, which I don't need to remind you of the figures, but included an additional roughly 2 to 3% added to the German population in 12 months, an additional 2 to 3% added to the Swedish population within 12 months, that these numbers, as he said, the Frontex figures showed that at least 60% of the arrivals that year had, quote, no more right to be in Europe than anybody else in the rest of the world. Well, that's a heck of a mistake to have made. That's a heck of a mistake to have made. To have invited the world to come and then discover that most of the people who'd come shouldn't be here is a heck of a thing to have done. And the only consequence to date is that intermittently Chancellor Merkel says that the press always reports that she says she's sorry. If you read the text, what she says is, for instance, that she is sorry that Germany was not better prepared in 2015 for the intake. I myself am very critical of this because Angela Merkel herself in 2010 in her Potsdam speech says multiculturalism has failed, utterly failed, in her words. And then 5 years later, she opens the borders. What had she done in the 5 years between Potsdam and August 2015 to make sure that this had improved? Nothing. There had been no improvements at all in integration processes or anything else in Germany. So I find these apologies very hollow. In any case, I said to you that there were two effectively sides to this, which, crass as it is, we might think about it in. That being the, as it were, the them bit, the who is coming. And I can go into a lot more detail about that, if you would like, later. But the second bit of this is the us question. And this is something which I can get almost nobody to focus on. Even my critics, as I say, of whom sadly there are some, say to me that they are totally fascinated by what I'm saying about the immigration. They're horrified by it. They think I shouldn't say it. They think I shouldn't state the facts that are before our eyes. But nobody so far, I think, at all has picked up on what I regard as being the second and at least equally important issue, this us issue, because it's an odd thing to do societally and culturally, to, for instance, without any mandate from the general public, decide to become something totally different. It's a very odd thing to do. It's an odd thing, among other things, for society to effectively decide to abolish what it has been hitherto and to become something totally new. And in different ways in each of our countries, something is underway which is that. It's what I describe as the turning of European nations into sort of versions of the UN, where states should ideally behave like large charitable foundations, distributing funds around the world, looking after the nest egg to some extent, but not much beyond that. A distributive body. And every single country I can think of now in Western Europe has effectively formally taken this kind of leap. And there are various reasons I think we've done that, some of which I go into in the book. Among them, among the causes, I should say, are issues which we have thought far too shallowly about. For instance, every European country has some version of what I describe, using the phrase from Pascal Bruckner, of the tyranny of guilt. We all have a version of the tyranny of guilt. We in Europe, this line goes, have had a very ugly past. We've had a very bad 20th century. Before the 20th century, we had colonialism, so we had a very bad 19th century. It's been bad for centuries. And as a result of all this, we need to expiate some kind of guilt. And that's why, for instance, we should make our home the home for anyone in the world who makes it here. This, by the way, I take it as read, you all know, is an extraordinary fallacy to have fallen into. I take it as read that absolutely every single people in the world have at some point behaved badly, or regrettably, or embarrassingly, or genocidally, or worse. But I find one-directional guilt a fascinating thing. Turkey, which I mentioned earlier, is a country that still illegally occupies a part of an EU member state and pays no price for this. Turkey ran one of the largest, longest, and most important empires in history, the Ottoman Empire. But I have yet to hear anybody argue that as a result of the Ottoman Empire, Turkishness should be abolished, or Turkey should be abolished, or that it should be made to become a UN-like NGO charitable foundation sort of state. It would be a very weird thing to do, to demand of modern-day Turks who had no involvement in the Ottoman Empire, that they should in some way pay the price for the historical sins of the Ottoman Empire. Yet Europeans seem to want this kind of guilt. It's almost like we want to be able to blame ourselves. It's a masochistic impulse. And as I've said before, the problem that all masochists, I'm told, at some point face is what happens when they meet a real sadist. You think you're terrible? So do we. You think you're irredeemable, appalling, base, cultureless? Good. We think the same about you. And so on. Now, this is only one aspect of it, but it's a very important aspect of it. Another, which I'll dwell on quickly, is what I describe, and this is one I wish there were more pushback on, and I never get it, which suggests to me that I'm on to something. I describe in the book what I describe as the sense that the story may have run out. Now, this is a very modern European issue, and I'll deal with it very quickly. But it goes something like this. And I used another French philosopher, Chantal Del Sol, a wonderful French philosopher. I steal an image from her. It goes something like this. In Europe, we had dreams of religion, all of which at some point fell apart. Some of which are still falling apart, some of which at least battered, bruised, singed. So the dreams of religion sort of were given up on. I say this not as a judgment, but as an observation. Then there's the dream of the nation state. The nation state, this line of thinking goes, led to conflicts, led to wars, led to invasions, and so on. And so we find ourselves not believing in the nation state. Then we get through the 20th century, and Europe produces two terrible totalitarianisms, another two dreams that turn out to be absolute nightmares for the entire world, communism and fascism. And these two dreams go, fascism in 1945, communism arguably not entirely yet. But that broadly speaking, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Europeans are left in the position, as Del Sol describes it, that Icarus would have been in if he'd survived the fall. That is, we tried to fly to the sun on this occasion repeatedly. We flew too close, and here we are, bruised, singed, battered, and yet alive. So what do we do? And the modern European answer to this so far has been the same answer that, among others, the communist elites in Russia did when they realized that their alleged dream was over. We have fun. We have a nice time. We buy things we don't much need, and we replace them quite soon afterwards. And we don't really discuss anything of meaning because we're not sure what the answers would be, and we hope that people don't ask awkward questions. And by and large, as long as everyone's standard of living keeps going up, which in Norway, of course, it might do, but in other countries in Europe are not so lucky, then everything might go along fine. This is, to my mind, tied up with the challenge we have in multiculturalism, which is that the multicultural era needs to find a way to explain why countries like this one are able to encompass the entire world. That is, both somebody who comes to Oslo from Bergen and somebody who comes to Oslo from Eritrea, for instance. It's actually quite hard to work out what everybody in the world might have in common. So what we do is, instead of saying, well, these are our traditions, we are a state along the following lines. For instance, I would say of Britain, if somebody says, what is Britain? I would say, well, we've been created as a Protestant Christian state that then underwent one of the best forms of the Enlightenment, if I say so myself. We have a parliamentary democracy, which is not nothing. It's quite rare globally. We have some strange but rather charming inheritances, including a monarchical constitutional structure, and we have a Church of England, which is rather annoying, but we go a few times a year, and a whole set of other things. But it's not actually that hard to define. If you invite the entire world in, and you have to have not only people from next door, but also somebody from Iraq, somebody from Korea, somebody from there, somebody from here. You have to do things that unify all of these things, and it's a basically impossible job. It would be like saying something that everybody in the world agrees with. All you can do at that stage is to say something like, I like puppies. So what we do in our societies is we say things like, what is your society about? And we say, our society is about being nice. We're about being decent and kind. Almost no society in the world says, not even the Saudis say, we're actually devoted to being total shits. Almost nobody actually says it. So it's sort of stuff that absolutely everybody is meant to be able to agree on. But this has a result, which is that your definition of yourselves becomes incredibly broad and unbelievably shallow. And you want people to become a part of that? You want people to join you in that? You think that some people aren't going to see holes in that? Or find critiques of that which, and this is the problem, are meaningful critiques? Now, currently, our solution to this is several things. The media's solution to this in most of our countries, and I think this may echo true here, is to pretend that there are only good things that happen and to not focus on any downsides. And if you focus on any downsides, then you're making the downsides happen. If you report the facts, you're causing the facts. If you say what you see, you're causing the vision. And this has been a case in every country, and it's in different stages, and it's always in different stages simply because of events. As I say, it's very hard in France these days to pretend that there are not some downsides from mass migration that you haven't controlled and haven't looked into the details of. It's quite hard. It's probably possible for a while longer in Norway. Maybe. It seems to not be working all that well in Sweden. And it's kind of stopping in my own country. Why is it stopping? Because it's very hard to say that there aren't any downsides to not really bothering to find out who's in your country. When, for instance, in the 1990s, you give political asylum to a man and a woman from Libya who are seeking asylum in the UK because they are political enemies of Colonel Gaddafi. Now, being a political enemy of Colonel Gaddafi in the 1990s was a pretty admirable thing to be, sometimes, not always. Not, for instance, if, as the man in this couple was, you're one of the leaders of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which some years later allies to Al-Qaeda and becomes the Libyan branch of Al-Qaeda. Why do I mention this couple from Libya who get asylum in the UK? Because they are enemies of Gaddafi, because they're from Al-Qaeda in Libya. I mention them because then they have a child the moment they arrive in the UK. The wife is already pregnant. 22 years later, the young man, as he is then, Salman Abedi, born, brought up in the UK, educated in the UK by UK taxpayers, goes to university in the UK, paid for by UK taxpayers. On a Monday night, goes to the Manchester Arena, and Ariana Grande is playing a concert, and detonates a suicide bomb, and 22 young girls have their lives taken. So that's a downside. That's a definite downside. And we haven't thought about any of how to deal with that other than from the media's point of view, let's pretend that that's a question we shouldn't ask. Let's not ask any of the details in that. Let's not bother to find out any of the details. A few weeks after that attack, when 3 young men ran across London Bridge and then through Borough Market, slashing the throats particularly of women, including killing 2 Australian girls, one of whom was a nurse tending to the wounded, slashing at women's throats, particularly singling out women, shouting, "This is for Allah." One of those people was actually from Morocco, pretended he was from Libya, had stayed in Britain, although he'd been found to be lying. He'd stayed anyway under his other passport. And one of the other men who carried out that attack was actually from Pakistan and had got asylum in the 1990s. Nobody is clear why in the 1990s you should get asylum from Pakistan, which is an ally of the UK's, better and worse. And that young man takes part in that as well. And by the way, again, the media, everybody after that attack said, what do the tech companies need to do to improve stopping this sort of thing? There's always pardon the French, there's always a bullshit argument that happens. And that's the one we've fallen into recently. Something happens like that, and you go, what should the tech companies do? There is still no evidence that any of the attackers that night did any of their connecting online. They didn't need to. But the man I just mentioned who got asylum in the UK in the 1990s from Pakistan, he was on the television in the UK just the year before that attack in a program called My Neighbour the Jihadi. He was one of the stars of the show. Which brings me on to the political class. Because when Theresa May and others say, as our Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan did, the tech companies might say, the tech companies had nothing to do with this, albeit there is an important role on other occasions. But if you wanted to know somebody who might be likely to carry out an attack like that, you didn't need to go into the dark web. You didn't need to do some GCHQ thing. You needed to turn on your bloody television. Because he was on it, saying, I'm a jihadi, on prime time. It wasn't hiding. It wasn't a covert operation in an Afghan cave. 8 o'clock, with commercials in the middle. The political class dodges this as well, because the political class realizes, well, the downsides that exist from this might come back on us. So we've got to find other things to divert attention onto. And one of the ways that that happens, as I say, is to try to pretend, and still that's going on, that basically there's nothing much to see here, or if we don't ask any of the deep questions, we don't have to get any problematic answers. And I think we're going to get some problematic answers anyway. The third thing on that quickly, I'll mention in the media, the politicians and the public, is this fascinating thing that's now breaking out all over Europe. I did an update of the book for the paperback, which came out a few months ago in the UK, and surveyed some of the changes, the political changes, which have been entirely predictable, but which had happened since the hardback of my book first came out. And that's the extraordinary elections that are happening all over our continent, all of which are totally foreseeable, and all of which basically fall into the same issue, which is an establishment of the media and politicians and many others who've found that the public keep letting them down. As the late Australian philosopher Ken Minogue once said, politicians find themselves in this difficult position. We, the public, seem to think the wrong things. We express ourselves the wrong way. We hold many of the wrong views. And it's amazing that they keep putting up with us. And we, the public, have discovered that we've become a disappointment to our politicians. It's an awful position to find ourselves in. The public keep coming back with the wrong answer. So now you have a set of explanations for this. The public are, for instance, misled by fake news. There is fake news around. When has there not been? I think that fake news was invented 2 years ago. Never read the New York Times if you thought that. Take what happened a few days ago in Germany. This stabbing of a German man seems to have got into a fight with a young Iraqi and a young Syrian man in Chemnitz, and then there have been these terrible disturbances and all sorts of. A set of politicians blamed the fake news. They said there were people saying that the man who was killed had stepped in to stop a woman from being hurt. And this is fake news. And these people are all being whipped up by fake news. Don't you see? It's all fake news. The German guy is still dead. And that's the key bit to focus on there. That's the bit you shouldn't be glossing over so fast. We get misled very easily that we're kind of simpletons in the general public, and there's so much we just keep getting wrong. These are very, very dangerous things for a political class anywhere to do. To basically say, I'm not going to listen to the public, I'm going to try to defeat the public. And I say on the migration issue, something which I want to leave you with, which is that I say that in the case of Europe, we're basically in the situation that a lifeboat is in. We think of ourselves as this, certainly from Norway, this is easier to think of than, say, in southern Italy. We basically think of ourselves as this continent that can just keep taking people in, and that we're a sort of huge liner. And I say that actually we're something more like a lifeboat ourselves. And we need to work out how many people we can bring in, how many people we can actually save from the undoubtedly terrible waters all around us, what our limits might be, and where we might sadly have to say no. Now, the thing about this is that lifeboats, as you know, have a thing on the side usually that say this boat cannot take more than 75 people, for instance. Now, we don't have anything like that. There is no sign on the side of Europe that says maximum occupancy, 400 million or whatever. We don't have that, and we're never going to have it. There is only one thing we have, which is that the people in the boat, if they think that it's getting very dangerous, have the right to say to the captain, stop bringing people on board. That's the one safety valve we have. And if the captain says, I'm not listening to you because you must be racist, then we're in real trouble. And the publics keep on blowing whistles, saying not we hate the world, not keep everyone out, nothing like it. All the polls show that the European publics are very tolerant about actual asylum seekers, for instance. All the polls show that. So we resent this attempt to make us all into bigots if we happen to not think the, as it's clear, fading narrative that's been going on for a generation. But every time the public tries to say, we're getting worried down here, they're told, shut up. And this seems to me to be an incredibly dangerous development. I'll finish on this thought, but we have to think, among other questions in these regards, about things like the following. Who is Europe for? Can Europe be the home of anyone in the world who walks in and calls it home? Now, my suggestion would be that the answer to that question is no. It cannot be, sadly, regrettably, but it cannot be. The welfare state will not put up with it. Societally, it will not put up with it. Culturally, it will not put up with it. Fine. In which case, you have to have an entirely different conversation than the one we've been having. You have to have a serious conversation about what your limits are, where those limits end, and how you can behave decently along the way with that in mind. And we, I think, in different countries are having some of that conversation. Some countries are going to run way ahead of that and have an indecent conversation. I've no doubt about that. But the surest way to have the indecent conversation is not to have the sane and sensible conversation now. So you have here, and what we have in my country, and what we have generally in Europe, is very unusual. It's very unusual. It is not the natural default state of humankind. It isn't the case that if you throw everybody into a cauldron anywhere in the world, it always comes out looking like Oslo. Sadly. But that's the case. So in that case, be careful with it. And sometimes people say to me, because we have now the resurgent questions about nationhood, and nationalism, and patriotism indeed, And many people don't like these conversations, and I don't like a lot of the conversation. But some years ago, I clarified this to myself when somebody said to me, "Do you feel patriotic?" And I said, that's a very difficult question to answer because I'm not entirely sure. I said, well, patriotism suggests something that you yourself maybe have contributed to and something you yourself have fought for and something more. And I'm just very lucky to have inherited this. So here's my response to that question, which I leave you with before handing over to you for Q&A on, by the way, whatever you want. I'm very happy to roam as widely as you fancy. No question too low. I'd leave you with this thought that my answer to this question is that you don't have to be some kind of tub-thumping nationalist. You don't have to be right-wing. You don't have to be left-wing. You don't have to be anything else. All that I would suggest to people as one of the ways through this is to recognize that we should approach ourselves and what we have with a sense of gratitude. To sense the gratitude for the unbelievable good fortune that we have. We can wish that the rest of the world had that good fortune as well. But then the great question for us is, how do we enjoy that good fortune without making sure that the next generation has something that's less fortunate? And I think that that's eminently possible, but it starts with a conversation, and it's a conversation I think we're way overdue to have. With that, I hand over to you. Thank you.